The old K-9 was freezing in the snow, but he refused to drop the one thing that could bring a Marine back to his past. Major Daniel Brooks first saw the German Shepherd standing alone at the edge of a quiet Wyoming road just before sunrise. The winter storm had painted the mountains white, covering the trees, the fields, and the empty path ahead with a cold silence. The wind moved through the pine forest, carrying the scent of snow and frozen earth. Then Daniel saw him. Shadow, an old military K-9 with a gray muzzle, tired eyes, and a body that showed years of faithful service. The dog was not running. He was not lost. He was standing beside a heavy olive-drab ammo box attached to a worn canvas strap. Every few steps, Shadow pulled the box forward through the snow. Slowly, carefully, like every inch mattered. Daniel stood still, unable to understand what he was seeing. He had spent years working with military dogs. He knew their behavior. He knew their instincts. He knew that a trained K-9 did not waste energy without a reason. Shadow, Daniel called softly. The old dog lifted his head. For a moment, the frozen mountain air felt completely still. The German Shepherd looked at him, then looked back at the box. That small movement carried a message Daniel could not ignore. The dog was not trying to escape the storm. He was trying to finish something. Daniel stepped closer, his boots sinking into nearly a foot of fresh snow. The retired Marine wore a thick winter jacket, but the cold around him felt different. It was not just the temperature. It was the feeling of seeing a piece of his former life standing in front of him after years of silence. Shadow had once been his partner. Before Daniel left the service. Before memories became too heavy. Before he convinced himself that walking away was the only way to move forward. The old K-9 should have been resting somewhere warm. Instead, he was here, carrying a box through the snow toward the one person who might understand why it mattered. Daniel reached for the strap. Shadow gently stepped forward, keeping the box close. There was no fear in his eyes, only loyalty. Daniel lowered his hand. He understood. Whatever was inside that box was not meant to be taken. Not yet. What did you bring me? He whispered. Shadow simply stood there, breathing slowly in the winter air. Daniel looked at the worn metal container. The paint was faded. The edges were scratched. It looked like something forgotten by time. But Shadow had remembered. That was what stayed with Daniel. Dogs remembered voices. They remembered places. They remembered people. And somehow, after all these years, Shadow had remembered him. Daniel carefully wrapped a blanket around the old K-9 and guided him toward his truck. The ammo box followed them, resting in the passenger seat like a silent passenger from another life. As the truck moved through the snowy mountains, Daniel kept looking at the box beside him. He wanted answers. He wanted to know why Shadow had come back. But deep inside, he already understood one thing. This was never just about a box. It was about a promise that had been waiting in the snow for someone to finally return. Daniel did not open the box that night. He had spent years learning patience, but this kind of patience felt different. It was not about waiting for the right moment during a mission. It was about respecting a memory that had traveled through a storm to find him. Inside his small Wyoming cabin, the fire burned softly while Shadow rested on a thick blanket near the fireplace. The old German Shepherd looked exhausted, but peaceful. For the first time in years, the K-9 was no longer walking through the cold. He was finally resting. Daniel placed the ammo box on the wooden table and studied it under the warm light. The metal was covered with scratches from time and weather. The markings were faded, but one detail caught his attention. A small identification code near the corner. Daniel leaned closer. He recognized it. His expression changed immediately. It was connected to his old Marine unit. A chapter of his life he had spent years trying to close. He ran his fingers across the surface of the box, remembering days when he wore the uniform, when every decision mattered, and when Shadow was always beside him. Back then, Shadow was not just a military working dog. He was a partner, a companion who understood silent commands, long days, and moments when words were not enough. Daniel remembered the first day they met. Shadow was younger then, strong, curious, always watching. The dog had a way of knowing when Daniel carried something heavy inside. His fellow Marines used to joke that Shadow could read his thoughts. Daniel never believed that. But sitting in that cabin years later, he wondered if maybe the dog remembered more than anyone expected. The next morning, Daniel contacted the local Veteran Records office to learn more about the box. He did not expect much. Old military items often carried forgotten stories. But when the information came back, Daniel felt the room become quiet. The ammo box had once belonged to someone from his past, someone whose name he had not heard in years. Marcus Williams. Daniel stared at the name on the screen. Marcus was not just another Marine. He was family. They had shared conversations that went beyond service. They had talked about life after the military, about their families, and about the things they hoped to do someday. Marcus had a son named Noah. Daniel remembered meeting the boy once, years ago. A quiet child who followed his father everywhere and looked at Shadow like the dog was a superhero. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered the promise he made to Marcus. It was a simple promise. One friend making a commitment to another. I will always look after your family. At the time, Daniel meant every word. But after Marcus was gone, Daniel changed. Grief made him distant. He convinced himself that staying away would make things easier. He stopped calling. He stopped visiting. Slowly, years passed. The promise remained, but Daniel buried it beneath silence. Shadow moved beside him and rested his head against Daniel's hand. The old Marine looked down at the dog. You carried this all the way here because of him, didn't you? Shadow stayed still. The answer was not spoken. It was hidden in the loyalty of an old friend who never forgot. Daniel looked back at the ammo box. He still did not know what was inside. But now he knew something more important. This was not a forgotten military item. It was a message. And somehow, after all these years, Shadow had brought it back to the person who needed to find it. For years, Daniel Brooks believed the hardest moments of his life were the ones that happened in uniform. The long days. The difficult decisions. The memories that stayed with him long after he left the Marines. But sitting inside his quiet Wyoming cabin, staring at an old ammo box that had returned from the past, he realized the hardest moments were often the ones waiting silently after everything was over. Shadow rested near the fireplace, his eyes following Daniel as he moved around the room. The old German shepherd had changed. Time had slowed him down. His fur carried more gray than before. But the loyalty that made him special had never disappeared. Daniel opened a drawer beneath his desk and pulled out an old photograph. It was one he had not looked at in years. The picture showed 3 figures from another chapter of his life. Daniel stood beside Marcus Williams, both wearing their Marine uniforms. Between them sat a younger Shadow, looking proud and alert. Daniel remembered that day clearly. Marcus had laughed because Shadow always seemed more interested in the camera than the people taking the photo. That dog thinks he is the one in charge, Marcus had joked. Daniel smiled at the memory. Back then, life felt simpler. They believed there would always be more time. More conversations. More chances to say what needed to be said. But time does not always wait. After Marcus was gone, Daniel changed. He did not become a different person overnight. It happened slowly. One missed phone call became several. One postponed visit became years of silence. Daniel told himself he was protecting Marcus's family by staying away. He believed his absence would make things easier. But deep down, he knew the truth. Leaving was easier for him than facing the pain. The next afternoon, Daniel finally opened the outer compartment of the ammo box. Inside was a small envelope with his name written across it. His hands became still. The handwriting belonged to Marcus. Daniel sat down at the table and looked at Shadow. The dog watched quietly, as if waiting for this exact moment. Daniel opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter dated several years earlier. The first sentence immediately caught his attention. Daniel, if you are reading this, then Shadow found you. Daniel stopped. He looked toward the old K-9. The words felt impossible, yet somehow they made sense. Marcus continued writing about simple things. About his family. About his son Noah. About how much Noah loved spending time outside, and how he always wanted to hear stories about the Marines and Shadow. Marcus wrote that children did not need perfect people. They needed people who stayed. Daniel read that line several times. It was not a criticism. It was not anger. It was a reminder from a friend who knew him better than anyone. Near the bottom of the letter, Marcus wrote one final message. Daniel, do not carry guilt forever. Carry the promise instead. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. Outside, snow continued falling over the mountains. Inside, the old Marine sat with a truth he had avoided for years. The ammo box had not returned to remind him of what he lost. It had returned to show him what he still had the chance to find. Shadow walked closer and placed his head beside Daniel's hand. For the first time in many years, Daniel did not feel like he was looking backward. He felt like he was being invited forward. The letter from Marcus stayed on Daniel's table for the rest of the evening. He read it more than once, not because the words were difficult to understand, but because they carried a meaning he had spent years avoiding. Carry the promise instead. Those 5 words felt heavier than anything he had ever carried during his time as a Marine. Daniel had spent years believing his greatest failure was something that happened in the past. But now he began to understand that the real mistake was not what happened back then. It was allowing the silence afterward to become permanent. Shadow remained beside him as Daniel continued searching through the ammo box. The old German shepherd never rushed him. The dog simply waited, the same way he had waited through the snow. Inside the next layer of the box, Daniel found a small collection of items wrapped carefully in cloth. A worn dog tag, a family photograph, a child's drawing folded into a small square. Each item seemed ordinary at first, but every piece carried a story. Daniel picked up the photograph. It showed Marcus standing beside a young boy on a sunny afternoon. Noah. Daniel remembered him. He remembered a quiet child who followed Marcus everywhere and always asked questions about Shadow. The boy had once looked at the K-9 like he was the greatest hero in the world. Daniel smiled faintly at the memory. Then he noticed something written on the back of the photograph. For the days when memories need a little help. Daniel looked down. Marcus had always been like that. He understood the value of small moments. He knew that a simple picture, a handwritten note, or a familiar voice could mean more than expensive gifts. Under the photograph was a small recording device. Daniel pressed the button, and for a moment, the cabin was filled with static. Then he heard Marcus's voice. Older, calmer, familiar. Daniel, if you found this, then I know Shadow did exactly what he was trained to do. Daniel looked at the dog. Shadow lifted his head slightly. Marcus continued. I know you will want to blame yourself. That is who you are. You carry everything, even things that were never yours to carry. Daniel closed his eyes. Those words sounded exactly like something Marcus would say. But I need you to understand something. My family does not need someone who feels guilty. They need someone who remembers them. The recording paused for a moment. In the background, Daniel could hear a child laughing. Noah, a sound from a time before everything changed. Daniel, you always protected people by standing between them and problems. But sometimes protecting someone means standing beside them. Do not disappear because you think it makes things easier. The recording ended quietly. Daniel sat in silence. The cabin felt different now. The walls that had once felt like protection suddenly felt like they had been keeping him away from the people who mattered. Shadow walked closer and rested beside him. Daniel placed his hand on the dog's back. You knew where this needed to go, he whispered. The old K-9 looked at him with calm eyes. Daniel looked again at the photograph of Noah. The boy from the picture was no longer a child waiting beside his father. Years had passed. Life had continued without him. That thought hurt more than he expected. Not because he wanted to change the past. He knew he could not. But because he finally understood that the future was still asking something from him. The ammo box was no longer a reminder of an old Marine mission. It was a reminder of a promise between friends. And now Daniel knew the next step. He needed to find Noah Williams. Not because Marcus asked him to. Not because he wanted forgiveness. But because sometimes the most important promises are the ones we return to when we are finally ready to keep them. The next morning, Daniel Brooks did something he had avoided for years. He searched for someone he once promised he would never forget. The old Marine sat at his desk with Marcus's letter beside him, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. Outside the window, the Wyoming mountains remained covered in snow, quiet and endless. But inside the cabin, something had changed. The silence that once protected Daniel now felt like something he needed to leave behind. He opened his computer and began searching for information about Noah Williams. At first, he hesitated. He wondered if he had the right to appear after so many years. He wondered if showing up would only reopen old memories. But every time he looked at Shadow resting near the fireplace, he remembered the reason the old K-9 had crossed the snow. Shadow had not brought the box to make Daniel feel better. He had brought it because someone was still waiting for a promise to be kept. After several hours, Daniel found the information he needed. Noah was living in a small town a few hours away with his mother. He was no longer the little boy Daniel remembered. He was now 10 years old, growing up, attending school, and building a life that continued without the Marine who once promised to stay. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time. The hardest part was not finding Noah. The hardest part was accepting that years had passed while he stood still. That evening, Daniel prepared for the trip. He placed the ammo box carefully in the back seat of his truck. He packed Marcus's letters, the photograph, the recording device, and every small piece of the story that belonged to Noah. Shadow watched him quietly. The old K-9 seemed to understand what was happening. "You really waited all this time," Daniel said softly. Shadow slowly stood and walked toward the truck. The journey through Wyoming was peaceful. Snow-covered fields stretched across the horizon. Small towns appeared and disappeared along the highway. Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel, but his mind was somewhere else. He thought about Marcus. He thought about the promise. He thought about the boy who once looked at Shadow like he was a hero. When Daniel finally arrived in Noah's town, he did not immediately go to the house. He parked nearby and sat quietly. For years, Daniel had faced difficult moments with confidence. He had walked into uncertain situations without hesitation. But this felt different. There was no uniform, no mission briefing, no clear instructions, just a man standing in front of the consequences of his own choices. Shadow rested beside him in the truck. Daniel looked at the old dog and smiled slightly. "You always knew where we were going, didn't you?" The German shepherd looked back with calm eyes. Later that afternoon, Daniel met with Noah's mother and explained everything. He did not demand forgiveness. He did not make excuses. He simply told the truth. He showed her the letters. He showed her the recording. He explained why Shadow had returned. After a long silence, she agreed that Noah should know. Daniel waited outside as the door opened. A young boy stepped forward, carrying the same quiet expression Daniel remembered from years ago. Noah looked at Shadow first. The old K-9 immediately recognized him. The boy slowly walked closer. "I know that dog," Noah whispered. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. A connection that had been waiting years to return had finally found its way home. Noah stood quietly in the driveway, looking at Shadow as if he was trying to connect a memory from long ago with the moment in front of him. The old German shepherd did not move quickly. He simply walked forward, lowered his head, and gently rested beside the boy. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The cold afternoon air moved through the trees, but the silence between them felt warm. Daniel Brooks watched from a few steps away, realizing that some reunions did not need explanations. Some bonds waited patiently until the right moment arrived. Noah slowly reached down and placed his hand on Shadow's fur. "My dad talked about him," he said softly. Daniel felt his heart pause for a moment. He had heard Marcus's voice many times in his memories, but hearing his son speak about him made the past feel real again. "He said Shadow was the smartest dog he ever knew," Noah continued. Daniel smiled. "Your dad was probably right about that." The boy looked at Daniel with curiosity. He knew the name. He had heard stories. But he had never expected the man from those stories to actually appear at his door. Daniel did not try to make the moment bigger than it was. He did not tell Noah about his regrets right away. He did not explain every year of silence. Instead, he sat with him and shared the memories that Marcus had left behind. He talked about the way Marcus laughed. The way he always carried extra snacks because he knew someone would need them. The way he believed small acts of kindness mattered. Noah listened carefully. Every story gave him a new piece of the father he remembered only through photographs and old conversations. Later that evening, Daniel opened the ammo box again with Noah beside him. Together, they looked through the items Marcus had saved. The letters, the photograph, the old drawing, the small pieces of a life that had continued even after someone was gone. Noah held the drawing in his hands and smiled. "I made this when I was little," he said. "Dad kept it." Daniel nodded. He kept everything that mattered. Shadow rested nearby, watching the two of them. The old K-9 had spent years carrying memories that humans could no longer reach. Now, one by one, those memories were returning to the people who needed them. Daniel noticed something that surprised him. He did not feel the heavy sadness he expected. There was still pain. There always would be. But there was also peace. For the first time in years, Daniel stopped seeing himself as someone who failed a promise. He began seeing himself as someone who finally had the chance to honor it. Before leaving that night, Noah stood beside the truck and looked at Shadow. "Will he stay?" the boy asked. Daniel looked down at the old German shepherd. Shadow looked back with calm, familiar eyes. Daniel smiled. "I think he already decided that a long time ago." As the truck drove away through the quiet Wyoming evening, Daniel felt something he had not felt in years. The past was no longer chasing him. It was finally walking beside him. And behind them, the old ammo box was no longer a reminder of what was lost. It had become proof that some promises never disappear. They simply wait for someone loyal enough to bring them home. The days after Daniel Brooks returned to Noah's life felt different from anything he had experienced in years. There was no sudden transformation. No moment where every old memory disappeared. Healing did not arrive like a storm. It arrived quietly, one small moment at a time. Daniel stayed in town a little longer than he originally planned. He told himself it was because Shadow needed time to rest, but deep down, he knew there was another reason. For the first time in years, he was allowing himself to be present. Each morning, Noah would visit with questions. Some were about Marcus. Some were about Shadow. Some were simply about life. Daniel answered every one. He did not pretend to have all the answers. He just shared what he knew. And for Noah, those stories became pieces of a father he wished he could have known longer. Shadow became the center of their quiet afternoons. The old German shepherd was slower now, but his spirit remained unchanged. Noah would sit beside him outside while Daniel watched from a nearby chair. The boy would talk about school, dreams, and the things he wanted to do someday. Shadow listened the same way he had listened to Marines years before. Patiently, completely. One afternoon, Noah brought out a small notebook. Inside were drawings and notes about the stories Daniel had shared. On one page was a picture of Shadow wearing a simple service collar. Underneath, Noah had written, "The dog who remembered." Daniel looked at the words and felt something move inside him. For years, he thought memories were things that kept people trapped in the past. But Noah showed him that memories could also build a bridge toward the future. That evening, Daniel and Noah sat outside as the sun disappeared behind the Wyoming mountains. The air was cool, but the sky was filled with soft orange light. Daniel looked toward Shadow resting nearby. "Your father trusted people more than he trusted circumstances," Daniel said. Noah looked at him quietly. "What does that mean?" Daniel smiled gently. "It means your dad believed people could choose to do the right thing, even after making mistakes." Noah looked down at the ground for a moment. "Were you sad when he was gone?" Daniel took a deep breath. He knew honesty mattered. "Yes," he answered. "For a long time." The boy nodded slowly. "Me too." Two simple words. But they carried years of understanding. Daniel realized that he did not need to hide his sadness from Noah. The boy did not need a perfect hero. He needed someone real. Someone who remembered. Someone who stayed. Later that week, Daniel returned to his truck and looked at the old ammo box sitting in the back. It no longer felt heavy. The metal was the same. The scratches were still there. But the meaning had changed. It was no longer a container of unfinished business. It was a reminder that love, loyalty, and promises could survive time. Shadow walked beside him as they moved through the quiet town. The old K-9 had completed the mission that brought him there. But Daniel understood something now. The mission was never just about delivering a box. It was about delivering hope to someone who had been waiting for a piece of the past to return. And in doing so, Shadow had helped an old Marine find his way back to the people he thought he had lost forever. The first snow of the season arrived quietly in Wyoming, covering the small town with a layer of white that made everything feel slower and more peaceful. For Daniel Brooks, winter had always carried memories. It reminded him of long roads, difficult moments, and years when he believed carrying everything alone was the only way forward. But now, the snow felt different. It no longer represented isolation. It reminded him of the day Shadow returned and changed everything. Weeks had passed since the old German shepherd brought the ammo box to him. During that time, Daniel found himself becoming part of a life he thought he had missed forever. He helped Noah with small things. He listened to stories about school. He answered questions about Marcus. He even shared old Marine memories that he once kept locked away. The relationship between them grew naturally, not because of a promise written on paper, but because of the simple moments they shared. One afternoon, Noah asked Daniel about Shadow's years in service. They sat near the porch while the old K-9 rested in the warm sunlight. "Was he always this calm?" Noah asked. Daniel smiled. "Almost always. But he had a stubborn side." Noah laughed softly. "I think he still does." Daniel looked at Shadow and nodded. The old dog had always been determined. That was what made him special. He never needed recognition. He never needed anyone to tell him he had done enough. He simply followed what he believed was right. Later that evening, Daniel noticed something inside the ammo box that he had overlooked before. Hidden beneath the old letters was a small envelope with Noah's name written on it. Daniel sat quietly for a moment before opening it. Inside was a short message from Marcus. It was not a goodbye letter. It was a message written for a future moment that Marcus hoped would come. Noah, if you ever find this, I want you to remember something. Your father's greatest pride was never a uniform or a title. It was the people he loved. Daniel read the words slowly. Then he handed the letter to Noah. The boy held it carefully, as if it was something fragile and priceless. After reading it, Noah looked toward Shadow. Did he bring this because my dad wanted him to? Daniel thought about the question. The honest answer was complicated. Maybe Marcus never knew exactly what would happen. Maybe he never imagined Shadow would cross snowy roads years later carrying a message. But Daniel believed one thing. The loyalty between people and animals was built through trust, and trust could survive longer than anyone expected. I think Shadow remembered what mattered, Daniel said. Noah smiled. He really is special. That night, Daniel sat outside the cabin while Shadow rested nearby. The stars were bright above the mountains. For years, Daniel had wondered if he could ever forgive himself for leaving the past behind. Now he understood that forgiveness was not about forgetting. It was about accepting that people could return, rebuild, and choose differently. Shadow slowly lifted his head and looked toward Daniel. The Marine smiled. You know, old friend, you were never just following orders, were you? The dog closed his eyes peacefully. The answer was already clear. Shadow had followed something deeper than training. He had followed loyalty. And because of that loyalty, a broken promise had finally become a new beginning. Months passed, but Daniel Brooks never forgot the morning when Shadow walked out of the snow carrying a promise that had waited years to be fulfilled. Life did not return to the way it was before. It became something new, something quieter, something more meaningful. The small town in Wyoming slowly became a place where old memories and new beginnings existed together. Daniel still woke up early every morning, a habit he carried from his Marine days. But now, instead of sitting alone with his thoughts, he often found Noah waiting outside with questions, stories, and a smile that reminded him of Marcus. Shadow spent his days between them, moving a little slower but always staying close. The old German shepherd no longer carried a heavy box through the snow. His mission had changed. Now, he simply watched over the people he had brought together. One afternoon, Daniel and Noah visited a quiet field outside town. The mountains stood in the distance, and the wind moved gently through the grass. Noah carried the old photograph from the ammo box. He looked at it carefully, comparing the young Marcus in the picture with the stories Daniel had shared. I wish I could have known him better, Noah said. Daniel sat beside him. For a moment, he searched for the perfect words. Then he realized the truth did not need to be complicated. Your father loved you more than anything, Daniel said. Every story he told, every choice he made, came from that love. Noah looked down at the photograph and smiled softly. It was not a smile without sadness. It was a smile that showed he finally understood something important. Some people leave this world, but they do not disappear. They remain in the lessons they teach, the kindness they leave behind, and the people who continue carrying their love forward. Later that day, Daniel returned the ammo box to a special place in his cabin. It was no longer hidden away. It sat on a wooden shelf where it could be seen every day. The scratches on the metal remained. The old marks from years ago were still there. Daniel never wanted to remove them. They were proof of a journey that changed 3 lives. His own, Noah's, and Shadow's. That evening, Daniel sat near the fireplace while Shadow rested beside him. The old K-9 breathed slowly, peaceful and comfortable. Daniel placed a hand gently on the dog's head. You know, I spent years thinking I lost my purpose, he whispered. But maybe I was just waiting to find it again. Shadow opened his eyes for a moment, then rested again. Outside, snow began falling softly over the mountains. The same snow that once represented loneliness now felt like a reminder of hope. Daniel finally understood what Marcus had tried to tell him. A promise was not something you made only when life was easy. A promise was something you carried, even when time passed, and the path became difficult to find. Shadow had never forgotten. He remembered a person. He remembered a family. He remembered a promise. And because one old K-9 refused to let the past disappear, a Marine found his way back. A boy found a piece of his father, and a forgotten promise finally came home. Some stories are not about heroes who change the world. They are about small acts of loyalty that quietly change a few hearts forever.